In the entire history of naval warfare, no officer has ever matched the audacity, the brilliance, and the sheer reckless courage of Thomas Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald. This is a man who captured a Spanish frigate 3 times larger than his own ship using nothing but insane bravery and a handful of men. A man who was betrayed and destroyed by his own country, stripped of his rank, his titles, his honor, and then went on to liberate 3 nations on 3 different continents from colonial empires. A man whose real-life exploits were so extraordinary that novelists borrowed them to create fictional heroes like Jack Aubrey and Horatio Hornblower, because no one would believe the truth if they simply wrote it as history. The British Admiralty hated him because he exposed their corruption. His enemies feared him because he was unstoppable. His men adored him because he led from the front and never asked them to take a risk he wouldn't take himself. This is the story of the greatest naval commander you've never heard of. This is the story of the man they called the Sea Wolf. Thomas Cochrane was born on December 14, 1775, into Scottish nobility, the eldest son of the 9th Earl of Dundonald. But his family's title meant little when it came to actual wealth. The Cochranes were aristocrats in name only. Their estates were mortgaged, their finances a disaster, and young Thomas grew up knowing that he would inherit a title but not the fortune that usually came with it. He would have to make his own way in the world. At the age of 17, using family connections, he joined the Royal Navy as a midshipman. It was 1793 and Britain had just gone to war with revolutionary France. The timing could not have been better for an ambitious young officer seeking glory. Cochrane's early career was unremarkable. He served competently on various ships, learning his trade in the hard school of the Royal Navy during the French Revolutionary Wars. But in 1800, everything changed. At the age of 24, Lieutenant Thomas Cochrane was given his first independent command. The vessel he was assigned was HMS Speedy, a tiny 14-gun brig, barely 78 feet long, so small that Cochrane, who stood over 6 feet tall, could not stand upright below decks. She carried a crew of just 84 men and boys. Her guns were pathetic, 14 4-pounder cannons, weapons so light that their shot could barely scratch a proper warship. By any rational assessment, Speedy was a joke, a vessel suitable only for carrying dispatches and staying far away from actual combat. Cochrane turned her into a legend. Over the next 13 months, commanding this tiny vessel in the Mediterranean, he captured, sank, or destroyed more than 50 enemy ships. He developed tactics that seemed to come from the mind of a madman but worked with devastating effectiveness. He would sail close to shore, forcing larger enemy vessels into shallow water where they couldn't maneuver. He would attack at night, emerging from darkness to wreak havoc and disappear before the enemy could respond. He would fly false flags, use deception, employ any trick or stratagem that gave him an advantage. The French and Spanish learned to fear the sight of that tiny brig because where Speedy appeared, destruction followed. But Cochrane's greatest triumph, the action that made him famous throughout Europe, came on May 6, 1801, when Speedy encountered the Spanish xebec frigate El Gamo off the coast of Barcelona. El Gamo was a monster compared to Speedy. She mounted 32 guns, including 22 12-pounders and 8 8-pounders, compared to Speedy's pathetic 4-pounders. She carried a crew of 319 men, nearly 4 times Speedy's complement. By every measure, El Gamo should have blown the tiny British brig out of the water without breaking a sweat. Any sane naval officer seeing such a vessel bearing down on him would have fled immediately and thanked God if he escaped. Thomas Cochrane attacked. His plan was insane, brilliant, and executed with perfect timing. He approached El Gamo flying American colors, a neutral flag, getting close before the Spanish realized the deception. When the Spanish finally recognized the trick and opened fire, Cochrane maneuvered Speedy so close to the larger ship's hull that El Gamo's guns could not depress low enough to hit her. The Spanish shot harmlessly overhead while Speedy's tiny guns, firing upward at point-blank range, swept El Gamo's decks with grape shot and musket fire. Then, incredibly, Cochrane ordered his men to board the enemy vessel. 54 British sailors and Marines against 319 Spaniards. The odds were nearly 6-1 against them. What followed was one of the most remarkable close-quarters battles in naval history. Cochrane led the boarding party himself, sword in hand, fighting his way onto El Gamo's deck. The Spanish, confused and disorganized by the ferocity of the British attack, began to give ground. Cochrane ordered the Spanish flag hauled down, a signal of surrender. When Spanish officers tried to rally their men and continue fighting, Cochrane's crew boarded in multiple waves, each small group of British sailors fighting like demons. The Spanish, seeing their flag down and believing their officers had surrendered, lost their will to fight. Within minutes, the battle was over. Cochrane had captured a frigate more than 3 times larger than his own ship, with a crew nearly 6 times the size of his own. British casualties: 3 killed, 18 wounded. Spanish casualties: 14 killed, 41 wounded, and 263 taken prisoner. It was a victory so improbable that when the Admiralty received Cochrane's report, some officials suspected he was exaggerating. The British public, however, had no such doubts. Cochrane became an instant national hero. Newspapers published breathless accounts of his exploits. Songs were written about the Sea Wolf of the Mediterranean. When he returned to England in 1801 after Speedy was finally captured by a French squadron too large to resist, he was celebrated everywhere he went. He was promoted to post captain at the remarkably young age of 26 and given command of increasingly powerful ships. His career seemed destined for the highest ranks of the service, but Thomas Cochrane had a fatal flaw, at least as far as the British establishment was concerned. He could not keep his mouth shut about corruption and incompetence. In 1806, Cochrane was elected to Parliament as the member for Honiton. He used his position to expose and attack corruption in the Royal Navy and the government. He publicized the widespread practice of naval officers claiming pay for non-existent sailors, pocketing the money meant for their crews. He revealed how senior admirals gave commands and promotions to incompetent relatives and friends while ignoring merit. He exposed contractors who sold the Navy rotten food and defective supplies while bribing officials to look the other way. He made himself extremely popular with the British public and the common sailors who loved him for fighting their battles in Parliament as fearlessly as he fought the enemy at sea. He also made himself extremely dangerous enemies among the most powerful men in Britain. Those enemies would destroy him. In 1814, Cochrane was accused of participating in a stock exchange fraud, a conspiracy to spread false news of Napoleon's death to manipulate stock prices. The evidence against him was flimsy, contradictory, and almost certainly fabricated by his political enemies. The trial was a travesty of justice. Cochrane's defense was not allowed to call key witnesses. Evidence that would have exonerated him was excluded. The judge's instructions to the jury were so biased that they amounted to a direction to convict. Cochrane was found guilty, sentenced to a year in prison, fined £3,000, and ordered to stand in the pillory, a public humiliation. His political allies managed to have the pillory punishment rescinded, fearing that the massive crowds of Cochrane's supporters would riot if he was displayed in public. But the punishment did not end with the prison sentence and the fine. Cochrane was expelled from the Royal Navy, his name struck from the list of officers with disgrace. He was expelled from Parliament. He was stripped of his knighthood in a humiliating ceremony where his banner was physically kicked down the stairs of Westminster Abbey and thrown into a ditch. The message could not have been clearer. Thomas Cochrane, who had given Britain some of its greatest naval victories, who had terrified the enemies of the crown, who had been a national hero just years before, was now an outcast, a convicted criminal, a man whose name was to be erased from history. Cochrane never accepted the verdict. He knew it was a conspiracy, and he spent the rest of his life fighting to clear his name. But in 1817, facing financial ruin and professional destruction in Britain, he accepted an extraordinary offer. The newly independent nation of Chile, fighting desperately to maintain its freedom from Spain, needed a navy and had no one capable of creating or commanding one. They offered Cochrane the position of Admiral of the Chilean Navy. He would have to build a fleet from almost nothing and use it to defeat the Spanish naval forces that still controlled much of the Pacific coast of South America. It was an impossible mission in a country he had never seen, fighting for people he had never met, using ships that barely existed. For Thomas Cochrane, it was perfect. Cochrane arrived in Valparaiso, Chile in November 1818, and what he found would have discouraged any ordinary officer. The so-called Chilean Navy consisted of one barely seaworthy frigate, the O'Higgins, named after Chile's revolutionary leader Bernardo O'Higgins, a handful of smaller vessels in terrible condition, and a collection of officers and men with almost no naval experience. The ships were undermanned, poorly equipped, and had barely enough ammunition for a single engagement. Supplies were almost non-existent. Pay was irregular. The Spanish, by contrast, maintained powerful naval forces based in Peru, including ships of the line and well-armed frigates crewed by experienced sailors. Cochrane did not hesitate. He immediately took the offensive, refusing to wait until his forces were ready because they would never be ready by conventional standards. Within weeks of his arrival, he put to sea with his ramshackle squadron and began a campaign of raids, surprise attacks, and psychological warfare that left the Spanish reeling. He understood that he could not defeat the Spanish in a conventional fleet action. His ships were too few, too weak, too poorly manned, so he would not fight conventionally. He would use terror, speed, deception, and audacity to destroy Spanish morale and make them afraid to leave port. One of his most famous exploits came in February 1820, when Cochrane decided to capture the Esmeralda, the most powerful Spanish warship on the Pacific coast. Esmeralda was a 44-gun frigate anchored in the heavily fortified harbor of Callao, Peru, under the protection of shore batteries mounting over 300 guns and surrounded by 14 other Spanish warships. The harbor was considered impregnable. No enemy force had ever successfully attacked it. Cochrane studied the defenses and concluded that a conventional naval assault would be suicide, so he planned something completely different. He would go into the harbor at night in small boats, row silently through the anchored Spanish fleet, board Esmeralda by surprise, and cut her out under the guns of the shore batteries and the other Spanish ships. His officers thought he was insane. The plan seemed to guarantee death or capture. But Cochrane was convinced it would work precisely because it seemed impossible. The The Spanish would never expect such an attack. On the night of November 5, 1820, Cochrane personally led 240 men and 14 small boats into Callao harbor. They rowed silently through the darkness, passing within yards of Spanish guard boats without being detected. When they reached Esmeralda, anchored in the center of the fleet, Cochrane led the boarding party up the side of the frigate himself. The Spanish sentries spotted them at the last moment and raised the alarm, but it was too late. Cochrane and his men swept across Esmeralda's deck in a furious assault, overwhelming the crew before they could organize resistance. Then everything went wrong. The anchor cable could not be cut quickly enough. Shore batteries opened fire, their shells crashing into the water around the captured frigate. The other Spanish warships began to fire as well. Men were dying all around Cochrane as he directed the efforts to get the ship moving. He was hit in the thigh by a musket ball but refused to go below. Finally, with Esmeralda still under heavy fire from multiple directions, the anchor was cut free and the frigate began to drift toward open water. Spanish boats filled with soldiers rowed frantically to retake the ship, but Cochrane's men beat them off. Against all odds, Esmeralda sailed out of Callao harbor, past the shore batteries, through the anchored Spanish fleet, and escaped to open sea. Cochrane had captured the most powerful Spanish warship in the Pacific with 14 small boats and 240 men. Spanish casualties were 45 killed and 60 wounded. British and Chilean casualties were 11 killed and 30 wounded. The psychological impact was enormous. If Cochrane could strike into the heart of Spain's most fortified harbor and take their best ship, where were the Spanish safe? The capture of Esmeralda effectively broke Spanish naval power in the Pacific. Without their most powerful warship and with their morale shattered by Cochrane's relentless attacks, the Spanish fleet largely remained in port, refusing to come out and fight. This allowed Chilean and Allied forces to transport troops by sea without interference, leading directly to the liberation of Peru. By 1822, Chile was secure in its independence, and Peru had been freed from Spanish rule. Thomas Cochrane, the disgraced British officer, had created a navy from nothing and used it to liberate an entire continent. But Cochrane's relationship with the Chilean government deteriorated over unpaid wages and prize money owed to him and his men. The promises made when he was hired were not being kept, and Cochrane, never a man to accept injustice silently, made his displeasure known. In January 1823, he resigned his commission in the Chilean Navy and accepted another impossible mission from another desperate country on another continent. Brazil had declared independence from Portugal in 1822, but the Portuguese refused to accept the loss of their most valuable colony. Portuguese forces still held much of northern Brazil, including the vital northeastern provinces, and a Portuguese fleet blockaded Brazilian ports. The newly independent Brazilian Empire needed someone who could do what Cochrane had done for Chile, build an effective navy and use it to expel the colonial power. Emperor Dom Pedro I offered Cochrane command of the Brazilian Navy with the rank of First Admiral. Cochrane accepted, arriving in Rio de Janeiro in March 1823. Once again, Cochrane found himself commanding ships that were barely seaworthy, crewed by men with little training, facing a numerically superior enemy force. And once again, he went on the offensive immediately, refusing to give the Portuguese time to consolidate their position. His campaign in Brazil was marked by deception and psychological warfare even more than actual combat. Cochrane understood that the Portuguese forces in northern Brazil were isolated, dependent on supplies from Portugal, and demoralized by the news of Brazilian independence. He simply needed to convince them that resistance was hopeless. If you're finding Cochrane's story as incredible as I did while researching it, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment letting me know which part surprised you the most. Your engagement truly helps this channel grow and ensures that epic tales of naval history like this one continue to reach you. Cochrane sailed north with his small squadron and began a campaign of blockade, raids, and elaborate deceptions. He sent captured Portuguese officers back to their forces with exaggerated accounts of the size of the Brazilian fleet. He had his ships fire signal guns at night, making it seem as though a massive fleet was coordinating operations offshore. He sent messages to Portuguese commanders suggesting that overwhelming Brazilian land forces were marching to attack them, forces that did not actually exist. He offered generous surrender terms to Portuguese garrisons, and when they surrendered, he treated them well and publicized his magnanimity, encouraging other garrisons to give up without a fight. Within months, the Portuguese had evacuated Maranhão and Pará, the last major provinces they controlled in Brazil, often without firing a shot. Cochrane had expelled the Portuguese from northern Brazil using mostly bluff, theater, and the terrifying reputation he had built in the Pacific. But his relationship with the Brazilian government followed the same pattern as his relationship with Chile. Promises of payment were not kept. Prize money owed to his sailors was withheld by corrupt officials. Cochrane protested vigorously, seized a shipment of money he claimed was owed to his men, and found himself again in conflict with the government he served. In 1825, he left Brazil under a cloud of financial disputes, having once again liberated a nation only to find himself cheated of his pay. Cochrane returned to England briefly, still fighting to clear his name from the stock exchange scandal that had destroyed his British career. Then in 1827, he received yet another call from yet another nation fighting for independence. Greece had been struggling since 1821 to free itself from the Ottoman Empire. The Greek War of Independence had become an international cause, attracting volunteers from across Europe who sympathized with the Greek fight against Turkish rule. But by 1827, the Greek forces were exhausted, divided, and on the verge of defeat. They needed a miracle. They needed Thomas Cochrane. Cochrane was hired to command the Greek navy, such as it was, and given the mission of breaking Ottoman naval power in the Aegean. He was now 52 years old, his hair gray, his body bearing the scars of dozens of wounds from decades of combat. But his mind was as sharp and his courage as reckless as ever. He arrived in Greece in March 1827 and immediately began planning operations against the Turkish and Egyptian fleets. Cochrane recognized that the Greeks had neither the ships nor the trained men to win a conventional naval battle. So once again, he turned to new technology and unconventional tactics. Cochrane became one of the first commanders to employ steam-powered warships in combat. He ordered the construction of small steam-powered vessels armed with heavy guns and used them to attack Ottoman positions. Steam power gave these vessels a decisive advantage. They could maneuver independently of the wind, approaching enemy ships and fortifications from unexpected directions and withdrawing before the enemy could respond effectively. The psychological impact on the Ottomans, seeing ships move against the wind as if by magic, was considerable. Cochrane's most ambitious plan was an attack on Alexandria, Egypt, the main base of the Egyptian fleet that was supporting Ottoman operations in Greece. He proposed using fire ships, explosive vessels, and steam-powered gunboats in a coordinated assault to destroy the Egyptian fleet at anchor. The plan was never fully executed due to political complications and lack of resources, but Cochrane's aggressive operations helped wear down Ottoman naval strength and contributed to the eventual Greek victory. Greece achieved independence in 1832, becoming the third nation that Thomas Cochrane had helped to liberate. He had fought for Chile, Brazil, and Greece, commanding the navies of 3 different countries on 3 different continents, defeating the colonial forces of Spain, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire. No other naval officer in history has such a record. In 1832, something remarkable happened. The British government, under pressure from Cochrane's supporters and recognizing that public opinion had never accepted his conviction, finally pardoned him. King William IV restored Cochrane to the Navy list with his seniority intact, as if the years of disgrace had never happened. In 1847, Queen Victoria made him Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, restoring the knighthood that had been so publicly torn from him 3 decades earlier. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1851, Vice Admiral in 1857, and finally Admiral of the Fleet in 1858. The British establishment, which had tried to destroy him, was forced to acknowledge that he had been right and they had been wrong. But Cochrane never received an official apology for what had been done to him. The conviction from the stock exchange fraud trial was never overturned during his lifetime, though it was widely acknowledged to have been unjust. He spent his final years at his estate in Kensington, London, still working on inventions and naval innovations, still corresponding with former comrades from his campaigns around the world, still fighting to clear his name completely. Thomas Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald, died on October 31, 1860 at the age of 84. He was buried with full military honors in Westminster Abbey, the same place where his banner had been kicked down the stairs and thrown into a ditch 46 years earlier. 4 nations sent representatives to honor him: Great Britain, Chile, Brazil, and Greece. His funeral was attended by thousands, including many of the sailors who had served under him and loved him. The legacy of Thomas Cochrane extends far beyond his own remarkable life. In Chile, he is remembered as one of the founding fathers of the nation, the man who secured their independence by destroying Spanish naval power. November 5th, the anniversary of his capture of the Esmeralda, is celebrated as Chilean Navy Day. His statue stands in Valparaiso, and Chilean naval vessels still toast his memory. In Brazil, he is honored as the admiral who expelled the Portuguese and secured the unity of the Brazilian Empire. Without Cochrane's campaign in the north, Brazil might have fractured into multiple smaller nations instead of becoming the unified country it is today. Brazilian naval historians regard him as one of the greatest commanders in their history. In Greece, he is remembered as a Philhellene, a friend of Greek liberty, who came to their aid when their cause seemed hopeless. Greek naval officers still study his tactics and operations as examples of how to defeat a superior enemy through audacity and innovation. And in Britain, once they stopped trying to destroy him, he was recognized as one of the greatest naval commanders in British history, an officer whose tactical brilliance and personal courage matched that of Nelson himself. The novelist Frederick Marryat, who served under Cochrane, used him as the model for many of his heroic characters. C.S. Forester based Horatio Hornblower on Cochrane's exploits. Patrick O'Brien's Jack Aubrey is directly inspired by Cochrane's career. When these authors needed to create a naval hero, they looked to the real man whose actual deeds were more extraordinary than anything they could invent. But perhaps Cochrane's greatest legacy is what he proved about leadership, courage, and integrity. He proved that one man with determination and skill could change the course of history. He proved that you could be betrayed by your own country, stripped of rank and honor, disgraced and exiled, and still rise again through sheer force of character and ability. He proved that corruption and injustice could be fought and eventually overcome, even if it took decades. He proved that loyalty to principle mattered more than loyalty to institutions that had become corrupt. Thomas Cochrane's career offers lessons that remain relevant today. He showed that unconventional tactics, applied by a commander willing to take risks, could defeat conventionally superior forces. Every one of his great victories came from refusing to fight the enemy on the enemy's terms. When he commanded Speedy against El Gamo, conventional tactics would have meant certain death, so he maneuvered to make the enemy's advantages irrelevant and turned his own weaknesses into strengths. When he needed to capture Esmeralda from an impregnable harbor, he did not try to fight his way in with ships. He went in at night with small boats and audacity. When he needed to expel the Portuguese from Brazil, he did not try to defeat them in battle. He convinced them that defeat was inevitable and that surrender was their best option. He also showed the importance of leading from the front. Cochrane was wounded multiple times throughout his career because he was always in the most dangerous place, always leading boarding parties himself, always taking the risks he asked his men to take. His sailors would follow him anywhere because they knew he would never ask them to do something he would not do himself. That kind of leadership cannot be faked, and it creates loyalty that survives any hardship. And finally, Cochrane showed that integrity matters, even when maintaining it costs you everything. He could have accepted his conviction quietly, served his sentence, and kept his position in British society. Instead, he fought the injustice publicly for the rest of his life, even when it meant exile and poverty. He refused to compromise his principles, even when it would have been easier to do so. That refusal to accept corruption and injustice, that absolute commitment to truth and honor, ultimately vindicated him and forced the establishment that destroyed him to acknowledge their wrong. So who was Thomas Cochrane? He was the greatest naval commander most people have never heard of. He was the man who captured a frigate 3 times larger than his own ship. He was the officer so brilliant and so dangerous that his own country destroyed him when he threatened their corruption. He was the admiral who liberated 3 nations on 3 continents from colonial rule. He was the sea wolf, the terror of the Pacific, the man whose enemies feared to face him and whose sailors would follow him into hell. He was a man betrayed by his country who became a hero to countries that were not even his own. He was a man stripped of everything who rebuilt his reputation through courage and ability. He was a man who proved that one individual fighting for what is right can change the world. That is the legacy of Thomas Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald. That is why his story deserves to be remembered. If you enjoyed this story of the most audacious naval commander in history, make sure to subscribe for more epic tales from the age of fighting sail. Next time we will tell the story of HMS Victory in the Battle of Trafalgar, where another legendary admiral gave his life to save his nation. But that is a story for another day. The sea wolf has left us, but his legend endures.